I'm back with Coleman Hughes, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins. Welcome back. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Bridget. It's been too long.
Yeah, it has been too long. Congratulations on your book. I'm really
Thank you.
excited for you. The End of Race Politics. How has the response been?
Response has been great.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I got even semi-warm coverage in the New York Times, which I think would have been unthinkable 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I have a couple. I was wondering if overall you feel like things are trending, what the trend seems like to you as somebody who kind of lives and breathes the culture wars yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the elite trend is definitely away from wokeness, social justice. There are many examples of this. My piece is just being one, another being the recent piece about rapid onset gender dysphoria in the New York
Mm-hmm.
Times by I think Pamela Paul was her name, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. A lot of things getting. I mean, the Times I think is kind of a bellwether, and a lot of things that are being written there and said there are things that would have been considered kind of anathema 5 years ago, unfairly so. But I think that's part of a positive trend. If Trump wins, it may all reverse,
Yeah.
and it may be a repeat of 2016 to 2020 all over again.
I know. I was just saying this the other day to somebody that I feel like we're making progress, but we could be back where, it's the existential, the one and only existential threat, and everything else goes back, like you said, reverts to the 2016, 2020 years, which were actually insane when you really consider some of the stuff that went down. I saw a lot of the stuff that was going on with TED. I don't know if you have any interest in talking about it or if you can, but you did your talk about color blindness, and then there was a lot of drama, it seemed, that kind of unfolded behind closed doors at TED. And then has it been resolved?
I guess it's been resolved in that me and Chris Anderson are on fine terms.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what happened there was basically an uproar among some employees at TED. I don't know how many, um, who thought that my TED talk was really just like over the line. It made them feel unsafe. This was some of the language I was used. I encourage people to go watch the TED talk because it's very mild.
Yeah, it's
And when
very
I
mild.
when I describe what happened and the backlash to it at TED, and then people actually watch it, they're astounded because they expected some kind of flame throwing rant, and what they got was just what they see is actually just kind of Martin Luther King updated for the 21st century in very mild language and mild manner. So yeah, it was a whole debacle, and I ended up having to do a debate with Jamel Bowie and releasing that as a condition of releasing the TED Talk, which is a bit strange and doesn't typically happen. And then in the end, the only reason I went public about the whole affair was because I had agreed with TED that I would do this debate and they would promote my TED Talk normally, but they didn't do that. They ended up not promoting my TED Talk at all, such that it had a tiny fraction of the number of views of every other TED Talk.
Right.
You're like, so basically that's what happened, and it's just another example of a kind of internal meltdown that has happened at a lot of places, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
elite institutions that basically have a handful of employees that don't believe in viewpoint diversity, don't believe in freedom of speech. Of course, freedom of speech, it's only meaningful for views that you dislike.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone claims to support it, but many of these institutions have a handful of employees that don't, and those employees often end up holding the whole organization hostage by invoking the language of safety and harm, which a boss sort of many bosses find harder to ignore than simply saying, I disagree with that guy and I don't think he should be here.
Right. Yeah, because then you're getting into HR territory.
That's right.
So was the fallout from that? I mean, you're on good terms with Chris, is he the head of TED?
Yes.
Yeah, that seemed so strange. Even in it was 2023 when this
Yeah.
happened. It seems
Yeah.
strange to happen because, again, I don't. This is my biggest question for you when you do get these reactions. Why don't people want to hear that maybe the world isn't as racist as they think it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. You would think that good news would be welcome, but it's not. Well, there's a few reasons for it. One is that the media always wants to report what's bad and doesn't they don't profit off of good news. So, if it bleeds, it leads. Steven
Mm-hmm.
Pinker has written about this. Many writers have written about this. So, racism sells very well as a news item, but progress around racism does not sell very well. You're not going to get 100,000 clicks on your news article if you're talking about how much things have improved in society in any domain.
Mm.
So there's that, but then there's also, I think, the fact that many people want to explain the persistence of racially unequal outcomes. That is, Black people are 13% of the U.S. population, but not 13% of every desirable aspect of society. Don't have 13% of the wealth, and so on and so forth. People like Ibram Kendi and many others have argued that this can only be a function of racism. In other words, racism is the only reason why Black people or any group would have less than their census share of wealth or any other resource. And so to make the math add up, racism has to remain at an all-time high in order to explain those disparities. Now, other scholars like Thomas Sowell have spent a career um, really successfully challenging the idea that disparities equal racism or disparities can only be caused by racism. And I write about this in my book. I say that disparities are like tumors. They seem very scary and indicative of a problem, but the fact is most tumors are benign.
Mm.
Which is also the case with disparities. Most racial disparities are benign. That is to say, not caused by unfairness or racism. And you can see this just by looking at the disparities within a single race, right? Just go to Wikipedia and look up household income by ethnic group, and you'll get literally a list of dozens of ethnic groups of the same race that have wildly different outcomes. Nigerian Americans make far more money than Haitian Americans. Russian Americans make far more money than French Americans. Chinese Americans make far more money than Hmong Americans. Indian Americans are the highest earning census group of any race, make far more than many white ethnic groups, actually all white ethnic groups, and much more than Bengali Americans,
Mm-hmm.
who you and I could not tell an Indian from a Bangladeshi.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not discrimination isn't explaining it there. And in general, you can't make sense of the disparities in society if discrimination is your main variable. So that's another big reason why people don't want to hear that racism has declined, because then the persistence of racial disparity makes no sense to them.
Right. I feel like, too, you have to take more responsibility for your own life. If
Oh, I thought you meant me specifically.
No, no,
That
no.
it's my fault that people.
It's your fault. This is all your fault. No, the individual is then forced to take more responsibility. I feel like everyone goes through this, no matter where they come from. And Rob Henderson, who I know we were talking about this as well. Just no matter where you come from, at a certain point around 18, 19, you have to look at your life and say, all right, I still have to make something of myself. I can't blame my parents. I can't blame society. I have to just pick up whatever cards I was given and try and play that hand.
Mhm.
But I feel like when you there seems to be a predominant culture of blaming all of, whether it's capitalism or racism or all of these systems instead of looking at yourself. I think it's easier to do that.
Hmm.
That would be one of my guesses why it
Yeah.
persists. But
Mhm.
you do write about, I love the part in your book. Can you explain what neo-racism is just for
Yeah, sure.
the audience?
So in my book, I talk about, I guess I don't know if I coined the word necessarily. I don't think I did actually, but I talk about this word neo racism. And I basically define it as the new philosophy of race, which sees whiteness as inherently evil and blackness, or really anything other than whiteness, as inherently good. And, I give many examples in the book where people just frankly confess to feeling this, to feeling that white people are kind of inherently an evil and colonizing and rapacious group of people, and that people of color have a some kind of inherent moral superiority. Um, but I take the as I think Zora Neale Hurston once said, I have the radical belief that black people are neither better nor worse than any other group of people.
Mhm.
That every group of people on Earth is capable of of moral greatness and moral horror, and that we should not racialize these basic human concepts like who is good in the world and who is bad. Any reading of world history is going to find everyone's ancestors have been on both sides of the slave trade, if you go back far enough, at least.
Yeah.
And everyone's ancestors, you're going to find trauma and famine and war and rape and so if we start judging people on the basis of a superficial, narrow reading of who their ancestors have been in the past 200 years, um, then we're really just unfairly we're reinventing a new kind of racism rather than committing to getting rid of the old kind of racism, white supremacy. So in my book, I just try to call a spade and say, look, like I define racism as Dr. King said, the doctrine of congenital inferiority of a group of people, and that applies to any group of people, at least in principle. So I want to denounce racism, whoever it's directed at: black people, white people, Hispanics, Asians, etc.
What was the most surprising thing you learned in writing your book?
So the most surprising thing that I learned was it's kind of a boutique, small issue, an issue that you may or may not, your readers may or may not even be aware of. But do you know about the famous doll study from Brown versus Board of Education? Have you heard of this?
Um, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So the quick recap. In Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, this is the Supreme Court case that integrated racially integrated schools.
Hmm.
Got rid of segregation in the narrow domain of public schooling. And one of the pieces of evidence in the Supreme Court case, or that the Supreme Court considered, was a famous doll study where they gave kids a black doll and a white doll and asked them which one is prettier, which one was uglier, which one was the nice doll, etc.
Okay, yes, I have heard of this.
You've heard of this, yes?
Hmm.
I assume so. Everyone's sort of heard of it. It's kind of one of the most famous social science studies in American history, and um, they partly decided, sort of on the basis of this research, that segregated schools were inherently inferior. So basically, I went and looked back at the actual study, and it turns out it really, first of all, it was a poorly designed study, but secondly, it actually found the opposite of what people said it found. And I put "found" in quotation marks because I don't think it found anything. I don't think this kind of it's not really serious research judged by modern standards. But there was a host of problems with it, and it actually found that the black kids in the segregated schools had better self-esteem numbers than the black kids at the northern integrated schools. And that was surprising to me because I've never actually seen that in any history book. The mainstream telling of that has been basically wrong. And so the point is obviously not that Brown versus Board was the wrong decision. It was the right decision, but it was made for the wrong reasons. And the reason that they did that was because they didn't want to strike down all of Jim Crow at once. They wanted to only do it in public schools so as not to risk overreach. And so for that reason, they had to rely on these weird studies instead of just saying the government can't look at race, period. So it was actually a pragmatic and kind of conservative decision to rely on these flawed studies. But that was the most surprising thing to me, just because you don't expect to find that one of the most famous social science studies in American history says the opposite of what everyone says it says.
What was flawed about the methodology and how they did that study?
Yeah. So, for example, if you read the study carefully, they basically say that the first time they did the study, the black kids liked the black doll better. So rather than consider that result a real result and mark it down, they switched the order of the questions. And then a lot of the black kids said they liked the white doll better.
Oh, interesting.
So if switching the order of the questions completely changes a result, I would argue it's a dog shit result.
Right.
It's the kind of study that would be thrown away and in the replication crisis of today. But at the time, you could just say, oh, well, the black kids seem to have high self-esteem. Let's switch the questions and see if the result, see if the result changes, and then ignore the first result because, so there's lots of problems with it. That was just one.
Where are instances of actual racism that you are either witnessing or hearing about, or where do you actually see that in society?
There's racism everywhere. I mean, there's always going to be racism. I think this is one of the things people have to be realistic about. Bigotry and tribalism is baked into human nature, and it's never going away completely. We can educate kids, and as we absolutely should, to live as colorblind as possible. We should punish racism in those areas where it's actually illegal to be racist, and so forth. But you actually can't eliminate racism or tribalism from society fully. It's never going to happen. It's like getting to a zero murder rate. That's just not. It's not on the menu. And so the most we can hope for is incremental progress, which we've made quite a bit of. In my book, I talk about the callback studies, which are the best evidence of racism that we have, where you send out identical resumes and you give one a white sounding name, one a Chinese sounding name, one an Indian sounding name, so on and so forth. I cite the biggest meta-analysis of callback studies in America and Europe in my book. And what it basically found is that, yeah, there's lots of racism against every minority group. And there isn't that big a difference. I mean, the amount of racism against Indians and African Americans was extremely close. And Arabs, I think, were the group that had the most racism against them. Even East Asians were fairly close to South Asians. And so there's lots of racism, but it has a surprisingly low correlation with actual outcomes. In other words, groups that experience racism, equal amounts of racism, are found at the top and the bottom of every metric you could imagine, from income to wealth to all the rest. So there's lots of bigotry, but it really is less important an explainer of outcomes than people think it is.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to me. I don't know enough about kind of redlining and all of these things and the long-term effects. And so I feel like I am not educated enough to know what those long-term consequences have been. And I know this is an area people point to, gerrymandering, although gerrymandering is weird because it seems like when your side is doing it, it's they use a different term than gerrymandering. It's like then the other side's doing it, it's gerrymandering, but when your team is doing it, it's redistricting or something like that, something more palatable. And then just like voter laws, I'm not sure. I'm always shocked you don't need an ID to vote. There does seem to be. Did you see all the San Francisco stuff coming in? Like
About this issue?
about the elections and how they were saying, like algebra's racist
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it seems like San Francisco is pushing back against a lot of I mean, this is in line with our opening talk about how it seems like there's a general trend towards kind of common sense insanity.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, the voter ID issue is one I've always been shocked by because I mean, the idea was that Black people struggle to get IDs because, for various reasons, but Black people basically lack access to identification, which is, well, it's just odd from a common sense perspective because you need an ID to buy a six pack of beer.
Mm-hmm.
You need an ID to open a bank account. You need an ID in so many domains, and it's not difficult to get an ID, right? And it's like I mean, it's almost a rite of passage. It's not fun to go to the DMV or to do anything like that, but it's not difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So to claim that um, a whole group of people struggle to get it is a little bit strange, and also, you know, insofar as you really believe that they can't get it, it's a kind of comment on the overall competence of the group of people in question that borders on bigotry of low expectations. Now, what was very interesting to me about this was that I always suspected that the people who said this didn't really believe it, that they were just kind of saying it, and it was a kind of false, sort of BS belief. And then I think that was confirmed in many ways during COVID when I was in New York City throughout COVID. I stayed down with the ship as many people left, but when the laws came in, the regulations, which said that in order to get into any restaurant, bar, or gym, and so on, performance venue, club in the city, you needed two things: Vax card and ID.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was very interesting that not a single person throughout the entirety of that policy, which was enforced, imperfectly, of course, but it was enforced. Um, no, not a single person said, "Hold on a second, aren't we restricting all of New York? Are we making all of New York off limits to Black people since Black people can't get IDs?"
Yeah.
I think the thing about things you don't really believe is that you sometimes forget you don't believe them. And is it Mark Twain or someone that said, "If you don't lie, you never have to remember what you said," or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
So this was something I found kind of rich during COVID, that no one even brought it up as an issue.
Yeah, no one that is a really good point. And it was something too that was the Vax cards was a weird thing because again, no one seemed to have an issue. No one seemed to bring up like the historical suspicion people like Black people have with getting vaccines or mass. My friends in comedy were like, we have just audiences of white people, and because even the comedy clubs needed the
Mhm.
Vax cards, even for the comics in some instances, and they were like, this is so weird, like and creepy, and no one's commenting on it. They were like, where are all the left wing people talking about how the Vax cards are kind of inherently racist and exclusionary? But you didn't really hear it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're racist and exclusionary though, but I would say there definitely is more distrust of the government in the Black community for partly cultural and historical reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't the normal "this is racist and exclusionary" narrative that you would hear around
Hmm.
something like this in general. I feel
Right.
that I thought was kind of missing from. I was like, where's everybody who's normally saying this? But
Right.
in your book, I think my favorite part was where you break down. Well, there was a lot of favorite parts, but where you talk about the kind of comforting falsehoods that help no one,
Hmm.
that basically come out of this neo-racist ideology. And there's a lot there are a lot of comforting falsehoods. I was surprised at how long the
Yeah,
list
sure.
is. And I think the one that you talked about the myth of no progress. There has obviously been progress. What of all of the falsehoods that you lay out do you think is the most damaging? If there was one that was the most damaging.
I think the one that is most damaging in journalism and media is the disparity fallacy, which I've already gone
Mhm.
over.
Mhm.
But is another one that causes a lot of tension in this country is the attitude towards history, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of white supremacy, and the question, does America want to really look into its past and sort of be held accountable? Essentially, there's this narrative. Obviously, there's a narrative on the far right that just says knee jerk rejects anything wrong America has ever done. But there's a narrative on the mainstream left which does the opposite, which plays up America's unique evil in history and really whitewashes the history of anything America has tried to do to acknowledge and atone for its history. So I'll take both of those issues. The issue of America's unique evil. When you say the word, this is a point Thomas Sowell made as well. When you say the word war or famine, you don't think of any particular country, right? You think, okay, there was a famine in Ireland, there's a famine in China, there's been famines almost everywhere
Mhm.
that there's been civilization. When you think of war, you don't think of a particular country. You think, okay, there was World War II, there was Civil War, there's wars in China, there's wars in Africa, there's wars everywhere. When you think of the word slavery, Americans think of one place and one time. They think of America.
Mhm.
Now that's very strange because slavery is a, precisely as ubiquitous throughout world history as war and famine and all of these other scourges. So why is it that Americans only think of slavery in the context of American slavery between 1619 and 1865? Well, it's because there's there's a lot of miseducation and there's a deep investment on the part of some people on pretending that America is the only place that ever had slaves,
Mhm.
or that the version of slavery practiced here was so much crueler than the version of slavery practiced in other places, that those kinds of slavery just kind of weren't slavery. Now, I would encourage people to read any book on the subject, but a good one is Orlando Patterson's "Slavery and Social Death" is one I quote from in my book, where he says essentially slavery has existed on every continent, on every inhabited continent, not Antarctica, so far as I know, um, on every inhabited continent in almost every civilization prior to, say, 1600, um, going back some 10,000 years. And it was only very recently, as far as human history was concerned, that slavery was banned. And so to construe it so narrowly as America's original sin, as opposed to a human sin that went on everywhere on Earth, including frankly today, in some places there are still millions of slaves around the world, um, and went on in some places much longer than it did in America. I think there are countries in the Middle East that didn't ban slavery until the 60s.
Hmm.
There's one country that I think Mauritania didn't ban it until the 80s.
Wow.
So this is a human phenomenon. It's a human scourge, and to construe it as a narrowly American one makes a mockery of history. And so on the second point, so America's not unique. On the second point, uh, with respect to like do Americans have some kind of special resistance to looking at our own past and reckoning with the facts of history? I would argue not. I would say second to Germany, we are probably the only country in the world that we're probably the country in the world that has looked into its past most.
Hmm.
So, for example, there are more books about American slavery than about any other example of slavery going back 10,000 years, though slavery has existed for thousands of years in China, in Korea, in Africa, in the Arab world, millions of slaves in the Arab world. The Aztecs had slaves. There are far more books about American slavery written by Americans than about any other example of slavery, perhaps more than written about all the other examples of slavery combined. Okay, perhaps I don't know if that's true, but it very well might be. That doesn't smell to me of a country that is uniquely uninterested in examining its sins. We have a great museum in Washington, D.C., dedicated to African American history with an extensive exhibit on slavery in the Middle Passage. And when it opened, that exhibit was so oversubscribed and overflowing that they had to triage people at the entrance. Again, doesn't sound to me like a country that's especially uninterested in looking into its past sins. Both houses of Congress officially apologized for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008, 2009. The Senate apologized for lynching in 2004. At least 8 different states, and of course, slavery was a state issue.
Hmm.
Uh, 8 different states have officially apologized for slavery. Might be more at this point.
I want to know about the states that are like, we're not apologizing.
Well, it's mostly been southern states, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's a good point. I mean, I think every state that had slaves should officially apologize just to get it on the record, including many of the northern states. But I mean, I could go on and on. Point is, much has been done in the spirit of acknowledging and atoning for history, but the second it's done, it just gets pocketed and taken for granted as not meaningful. 2 of our 11 federal holidays are dedicated to different aspects of the Black freedom struggle: Martin Luther King Day and now Juneteenth. And of course, if you acknowledge any of these things as meaningful, people just roll their eyes and say, oh well, who cares? Juneteenth, that's nothing. Well, that's not what people were saying before it was a federal holiday. Before it was a federal holiday, they said this would be super meaningful if we made a federal holiday out of the time that slaves in Texas finally learned that they were free. And people were even predicting that it would be difficult to pass because there would be such resistance to it. It breezed through Congress, and now only after the fact people will say, "Oh, well, that's meaningless. What are you talking about?" So there's this really bad faith game that's played where people will demand certain acknowledgments, and then when they're given, will say that they actually didn't mean anything to begin with. So that's the game that's played with this issue, which I think is pretty toxic and divides the country.
Where do you fall on the statues?
It's a good question. Look, I think symbols matter. I have no personally, when I see a Confederate statue come down, I say, fuck them. Like they rebelled against the country for a cause that wasn't worthy, and thank God they were beat. They were beaten. So I don't see why we should hold up people that were in fact traitors to the country in the literal sense, and traitors for an unjust cause. So I see no problem getting rid of Confederate statues. It's also I also acknowledge the meaning of those statues to the people that like them might not be the meaning that liberal elites like me, you know, uh, ascribe to those statues. So me, as a guy from New Jersey, um, when I see Confederate statue, I see not only racist and white supremacists, but people that seceded from the Union on the basis of an unjust cause of preserving slavery. There are other people that see those statues, grew up around those statues, and ascribe to them a different meaning, right? They don't like the statue because it was the guy that fought to preserve slavery. They like it for some other reason, relating to local pride or Southern pride or something like that, right? Some cultural pride, some reason that is more benign. So I can't tell him that it really does mean what I think it means.
Right.
At some level, it means both, and it means different things to different people. So I'm happy to see them come down, but I also understand not everyone who is upset when they come down is upset because they're like, yay, slavery, right?
Yeah, no, that's been interesting living in the South and going on some of these tours. And we've been watching, because I'm writing one of my stand-up bits is about how America's too fat for a civil war. So I've been just diving into Civil War history, and we've been watching the. What are you laughing at?
No, it's a hilarious take.
Yeah, it's fun. And I think you can go in really fun places with it and directions. And the more that I can know about this actual Civil War, because but even when you see the history of it, like it didn't start out as about the thing, because Lincoln didn't want to make it about the thing. And it became the thing because he was trying to tiptoe. It's fascinating watching the Ken Burns documentary, but something stuck out to me when it was a quote that I think they repeat more than once in the documentary. He says, one of the guys was like asked why they were fighting, and he said, well, because you're here, to the Union soldiers. And I do think that some people in the South feel like they were just invaded. You know, they were fighting. That stuck out to me. Like, yeah, I guess they felt like they were being invaded by another army, and they just kind of took up arms and fought. And
Right.
We were in Franklin, Tennessee, and we went to one of the battlefields, and you could tell that they were, descendants of Confederate soldiers. And the woman was very concerned about what happened to the boys and where they were buried. And there are people who are descendants of all of these kids who died. And I guess the symbol is of that for them. Whatever sacrifice they made, whether it was in vain or stupid, it was still their relatives who were idiots.
Right.
Like there's a statue for their idiotic relatives.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I see. I've always been kind of like, I don't know. It also reminds me of history. It also reminds me of what I don't think we should be throwing parades for these people, but it is a symbol of something that happened, and then they're all gone, and now
I
never
think
happened.
it's kind of it's a failure of empathy to not sufficiently ask why someone else likes something, because what you see in it may not be what they see in it. And so, like I said, if it were up to me, I would bring down every single Confederate statue, because to me it's so, the only thing I see in it is the South's cause in the Civil War and the people that took up arms in order to preserve a slave society. But like you said, I also am curious about what other people see in things, right? And these are complicated matters. I would hope, though, that the people that do see that kind of pride element could understand why the rest of the country, Black people in particular, but just in general, why we see what we see.
Yes.
There's
also, as you mentioned, the bad faith kind of toxic tactics that occur. you now have people wanting to take down statues of George Washington or Lincoln. And so the argument, which I think is flawed, but there's this idea, or you'll hear people saying this is just a kind of slippery slope to tearing it all down.
Right. So I see a sharp distinction between Confederates and the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were the people that built the country that you and I live in today, and that we continue to choose to live in. That
Until Texas secedes.
Yeah, true. That built the experiment in liberal democracy that so many other countries have replicated. That remains arguably the first and foremost destination for the migrants of the world of all colors. So, the fact that many of the founding fathers also held slaves, that's not what I see when I see a statue of Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. That is a fact about them, and it's a fact that made them men of their age, but it's not a unique fact about them. As I said, at that time, in the 1700s, slavery was accepted as normal in most parts of the world, right? That's right around the time where the world was just, slavery was, anti-slavery was like the new hip idea of the day, right? It was actually a break from history where in the ancient world, it was just obvious that of course slavery is okay. I don't want to be a slave, right? That was everyone's attitude. Of course, I prefer to not be a slave, but there's nothing inherently morally wrong with slavery as a concept. That's why the laws for how to treat your slave are in the Bible, right? There's not a word of the Bible that says, not even Jesus. Jesus could have easily said, hey, slavery is wrong. This whole slavery thing, the Torah got that wrong. It's never okay to enslave another person. That's not what he said.
Yeah.
Okay. Nor did the Prophet Muhammad say that, right? So they had ways to treat your slave nicer in certain, but okay. So this was the ancient world, and there was bound to be a period between that ancient world and the new world where slavery is abolished everywhere, where there's a period of transition and hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
And that's the world into which the founding fathers were born. What was distinctive about them was not that they participated in those evils. What was distinctive about them is that they founded the first country based on the experiment of liberal democracy that ended up working so well that most of the world has tried to emulate it. And if not, most of the world has tried to get here. So that's sharply different from the Confederates that wanted to secede from that experiment so that they could continue for all time persisting in a slave society.
But isn't the kind of Ibram X. Kendi, and I don't really fully understand the 1619 project, or what she's trying to say, but aren't they saying that that's why this is a systemically racist country, colonial oppressor system, is because the founders ignored the fact that they had slaves, and that, I mean, I could be not getting this right at all. I'm not quite clear about that argument, I guess. Their argument.
Yeah, their argument. One reason you might not be clear about it is because it's not entirely
clear,
coherent. So, for example, I mean, one thing I was quite mean about this one writer. I'm forgetting his name, sociologist, who wrote one of the main essays of the 1619 project. Forgetting his name, it's okay. But he wrote that the legacy of slavery is visible in the rows and columns of an Excel spreadsheet, because slave owners would use rows and columns to tabulate the profits of slavery.
Okay.
Now, common sense tells you that many societies, probably going back thousands of years, any society which had writing probably quickly discovered that rows and columns are a really good way of keeping track of things.
Yes.
and that rows and columns did not originate with Southern slaveholders. They did not invent the concept of using rows and columns. They were probably one of thousands of examples of it. Okay, that's just like what basic common sense would suggest. But the idea that when you're like doing your taxes on an Excel spreadsheet and doing your business expenses, you should stop and consider that actually slaveholders use rows and columns too. This is considered a profound insight by the
Right.
1619 Project and by a way of thinking that encourages you to see, the legacy of slavery hiding behind every doorway that you open, right? So I would argue it's an unrigorous mindset. It's an unhealthy mindset. It's almost paranoid,
Yeah.
and
And weirdly racist. Like if you're seeing this everywhere you look, you might be the racist person. If you're thinking about slavery and race, I don't know. It just seems like a lot of
you're definitely
projection.
race obsessed. I would say you're
Right.
definitely race obsessed.
So is the argument in the 69 Project that because that slaves got here in 1619 and they founded the country? What is her?
Yeah, she's basically arguing that we traditionally teach the founding of America as 1776,
Mhm.
but that we should kind of metaphorically reframe the founding of the country as 1619 when the first slaves arrived in Virginia.
Okay.
Though I think that they were indentured servants at that time.
And they were just workers for the colonies. Is that?
Yeah. Some
Okay.
were from Africa, some were from the British Isles, actually.
Mhm.
I believe either Irish or Scottish, but they were Irish. There were indentured servants as well.
My
From
people.
white indentured servants. And then over the course of the 17th century, bit by bit, that slowly evolved into lifelong racial intergenerational slavery. But it was a piecemeal process. It didn't start out that way. In any event, yeah. So her thing is slavery is so important to understanding the story of the country that we ought to understand the founding date essentially as the 1619 Project.
Okay.
Or as 1619. And then it's a series of essays just talking about how slavery was much more important to American history, I guess, than has been portrayed.
Mhm.
Like it's not one element of American history; it's the most important fact of American history, right? That's essentially her argument.
Do you think, like your good faith, is there anything you found interesting or maybe accurate, or is there anything that you took from that you made you say, "Huh, I
Not that
agree
I
with
recall.
this."
No, I hate to say. I mean, there was nothing non-obvious that I haven't heard or read a million times before.
Yeah.
That was interesting. The only interesting claims turned out to be false. So, for example, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who led the whole project, wrote that the reason, or one of the main reasons, the 13 colonies revolted against the British was because they wanted to preserve slavery, and the British were threatening to end it. So that turned out to be just totally false. Not only did it turn out to be false, it was known to be false at the time because one of the fact checkers that the New York Times hired, who happened to be a Black woman, a historian herself, fact checked it before it came out. She said, "You've hired me as a historian to fact check your journalist's history. This is wrong." And they ignored her and published it anyway.
I mean, it's kind of ironically hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, these are the same kinds of people that would say we need to lift up Black voices.
Yeah.
They hire a preeminent Black woman historian, and she says, "No, that's totally inaccurate." And they say, "Shut up. We're publishing it anyway."
This is kind of, it reminds me of what happened with, I think Barry was covering, she did the interview with the guy who had all of his, what was the, it was all going viral and recently, and my brain isn't,
Interview with
what is his
Roland
name?
Fryer, probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was,
Oh yeah. So that was amazing. It was amazing to hear Roland finally tell that story in full.
amazing.
I knew bits and pieces of it. Yeah, Roland Fryer. He's an incredibly renowned, talented economist, prolific in his research output at Harvard University, and um, he did a study around 2015 or 2016, empirically looking at police use of force in either Houston or Dallas, and was asking the question: is there a racial bias in how police treat Black people, both in lethal and non-lethal uses of force? Lethal would be essentially using your gun, shooting someone, and non-lethal would be arresting them, pinning them up against a wall, etc. He found that there was a racial difference in non-lethal use of force, that Black suspects were more likely to be roughed up, but he found no difference in shootings. And of course, the big narrative around that time, and continues to be, is that the police it's open season on unarmed Black people, that you're killing police. The police are killing Black men
By the thousands.
by
That's
the
what the
thousands. Yeah, that
average
was the
American
idea.
thinks.
And there were, I mean, viral videos which showed some of the worst examples of it. I mean, I think the Philando Castile
Yeah, in Minnesota.
was the worst. Yeah.
Yep.
I sometimes confuse it with Alton Sterling, but I think Philando Castile is the one where he's in the car with his
Yep.
girlfriend. He reaches for his wallet, something like that, or he tells the officer that he has a legal firearm. He's behaving exactly as you should, essentially, in that scenario, and the officer just freaks out and shoots him and kills him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people were seeing videos like that, which were truly awful to see, and they were building a whole narrative out of that about how the police were just going open season on Black men. The truth of the matter is that there were just as many videos of the police shooting unarmed white men in similar circumstances. I should say white people, because sometimes there's women. And that the extent of the problem was actually extremely small when you look at the numbers, right? It's like we were talking about something like, at that time, maybe 40 people a year unarmed and shot by the cops.
Yep.
Okay. Most of those were white people. Something like 30 to 40% of those were Black people. And we can talk about the reasons for that disproportion, but the point is the narrative was false, and Fryer did a paper about this. And when he got the result, and he's an extremely rigorous person, right? He does all of the robustness checks that top economists do with these kind of studies. He got the result, and he said, "I'm going to publish it." And people said, "Don't publish it," And his colleagues said, "Yeah, publish the one part where it found racial bias against Black people, but don't publish that other part." And Fryer was like, "Why would I do that? That would be completely dishonest. Obviously, I'm going to publish it. If the methodology is sound in the one, it's sound in the other." So he published it, and it caused a huge issue for him. And apparently, he had to get security or something. He was told, that there were threats on him, and so forth. And that may have been part of the reason why, when he had a kind of harassment allegation against him, and there was a somewhat coordinated campaign to kind of destroy him at Harvard. And it was partly because a lot of the other Black professors at Harvard, including Claudine Gay, didn't like this guy because of his research findings.
It's so wild. It does show me that it's more about this kind of ideology often being, reverse engineering what you want to be true for whatever reason, as opposed to what's actually true. What has music taught you about life? Just in a totally different topic.
I don't know if it's taught me much about life, or rather than it's added a lot of color to my life, you
Hmm.
know? Um,
I got to see you perform. You're very talented.
oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, music is my first love. I
Yeah.
still play music. I play trombone, I rap, I sing. I it's my yeah, I mean it's as they say the most fun you can have with your clothes on. And it's it's a domain if it's influenced my race commentary in one way, it's only that it's advertised to me the possibility of, real colorblind interracial friendship, camaraderie, working relationships, being in bands with people from all around the world of every color has advertised the possibility of transcending identity in virtue of a common passion and a common
Mm.
goal.
Hmm.
So, in some way, I think that probably has influenced my writing. Just in that way, that many people don't have anything to point to that advertises that possibility.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
and I bet that you would agree comedy is similar.
So similar. I mean, I just think of it's so fun to be back because I'm doing it. I took a hiatus and now I'm back, and just being in green rooms where everybody's giving each other shit and talking, everyone, it's just such a like equal level playing field of people from everywhere, all walks of life. Everyone's, I don't know, it just feels it's very much a meritocracy. You're either funny or you're not. There's not the audience, either responds to you or doesn't, and you can only get better by doing it over and over again. And I think this is something, as someone who kind of got caught in the like crossfire of the culture wars, I found myself much more gravitating back to the arts, which is what I initially was spending most of my time doing. And I love these conversations. I love Dumpster Fire, where I get to make fun of all of it. But I never really set out to be a pundit,
Mhm.
um, I find so much joy and like aspiration in the arts, obviously, that
Same here.
I don't necessarily get that same kind of feeling from politics, although I know a lot of people who just love the debate. Are you doing
Yeah,
CNN contributing now?
yeah. I'm an analyst at CNN.
Oh, okay, cool.
But yeah, I mean, I would echo your feeling. Like I get a lot more. I get a lot more simple joy out of music than I
Mhm.
do out of this kind of work.
Mhm.
I get something else out of this kind of work too.
What do you get?
I'm not exactly sure what it is. I mean, I do get the feeling that I'm using my talents to do something I care about. That's not quite joy though. I get a feeling of meaning, I would say. But I definitely get much more joy from playing music and uh yeah, bringing music to myself, my friends, and to crowds that want to hear it.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I ask myself, what do I get out of this kind of work and writing? And there's, some of it's fun. I wrote a piece yesterday that was just kind of fun about how boobs are back, and that's fun.
Sydney Sweeney.
Yeah. So you knew right away. Um, See, I grew up, and I was saying, as someone who grew up in the 90s, blondes with big boobs were everywhere. And it's funny, the younger generation, your generation, I'm not sure even grew up in the world that where this was just, you could go to any mall, which people don't do either.
When was Baywatch? And
That was my like
that was in
90s. Yeah.
okay, yeah, I was just too late for that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so that, and I like writing about that stuff, looking at culture. I really loved like Chuck Klosterman growing up, and that kind of
Mhm.
weird merging of looking at somebody said Bridget's writing about boobs, but she's also writing about America, and I was like, yes, that's what I love, that kind of writing. It could be more in my voice, and the pacing can be more. But then, and I also love doing the piece when I actually do journalism. But like I did this piece about what happened to Pride, essentially, and I kind of started with a question and then realized I was asking the wrong question as I interviewed all of these, Andrew Sullivan and Douglas Murray and all of these brilliant people. And that's a lot of work, but fun and interesting to me to hear from people and get to speak to people and hear their perspectives. So I love that aspect of it. I don't find politics entirely that aspirational. They seem, right now, the culture war, and maybe it's just the culture in general, feels very nihilistic and cynical, and everybody's grasping onto conspiracy theories, and people even that I think quite highly of in some regards seemed, I don't know, it's been an interesting time to watch a lot of people that are, scientists, or so I thought, pretty rigorous, get lost in what feels like kind of conspiratorial ideas because of COVID, and it's been strange. So that can be somewhat disheartening when I'm too much in it. And then I start going, why am I doing this? But and then that's partially why I just started getting back on stage so much, was because I feel like it's a nice antidote to that's what I want to do. I want to make people laugh. I love when that wave of laughter hits me. It's so I get that sense of like God and gratitude when it's like listening to music. Same thing.
Totally. Yeah.
Or playing music. And I definitely don't get that, battling someone on Twitter
No.
or even scrolling Twitter. So I have to just kind of make sure that I'm keeping myself in check in that regard.
Yeah, same.
How do you stay balanced with it?
I mean, I try to balance my time. I try not to lose my life in this work. Right. Try to have a life outside of it, friends outside of it, music gigs outside of it, and so forth. And all of that is a big part of keeping me psychologically balanced, because it's very difficult to stay balanced if 24 hours a day you're dealing with politics.
Yes.
Right.
But it's become so many people's identities.
Yeah.
And also just passion project and hobby, and there's so many podcasts that they can listen to and engage in, and so I feel I sometimes am like, am I part of the problem? But yeah, that it seems like a lot of people have made this their passion in life, which worries me.
Yeah.
What is your biggest defect of character?
Oh Lord, I mean, if I could see it, would it still be a defect?
That's interesting. That is the most Coleman Hughes answer to that question, of course.
No, it's evasive, but it's I think someone asked me what my blind spot was, and I said, if I could see it, it wouldn't be a blind spot. I don't know. I don't know what my biggest defect of character is. I'm not great at like promptly texting people back sometimes, which I think is not a good trait. But what are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, you could get a landline.
I'm sure it's whatever the problem is deeper than the mode of communication. Yeah.
I remember my dad was so resistant to cell phones. He was like, I don't want people to be able to get a hold of me whenever they want.
No, I mean, part of it is like I've gotten better about this, but I've always been someone that when I'm focusing on something, I don't want to be interrupted. And I can even like get angry at interruption, like whether or not I display it. So something about being interrupted by texts or emails while I'm doing something kind of sets me off. Not in a way that I start punching holes through walls. It just makes me frustrated.
Yeah.
So something about text and email is like inherently frustrating to a personality like mine. Whereas some people seem to just like drink in an email like it's like it's apple juice. Like it's just, oh, another one, happily, and will happily interrupt whatever they're doing. I seem not to be built that way. So that's something I've gotten better with over the years, of just being able to shift tasks and not have it phase me.
When I was working with this guy, Paul Shirley, he was helping me as like a writing coach, and he's all about doing deep focus. So I would have to actually schedule, because I very much will, and they've done all these studies that show that you're not multitasking isn't really a real thing. And so I would have to schedule like 20 minutes to check my emails and to check my texts. And that was very challenging for me. I have that. I think I have a personality that's naturally prone to like squirrel, just being distracted easily. What's your biggest asset?
Well, I think in this line of work, I've been told that I have an even keel temperament, which I think like there's a lot of smart people, and smarts get you only so far. There's this totally other skill, which is not intelligence, and you might call it temperament, which is to try to be fair-minded, try to not get swept into trends, not get swept into hysterical moments in the culture, not get too shaken by criticism, and to not recoil too far in the other direction of criticism you're getting. Like all these kinds of problems that have ruined the careers of some public intellectuals, commentators, and writers. I think I'm fairly good at that, at not succumbing to those. I don't want to say temptations. To those sort of problems, let's say.
Yeah. I think it's very hard. I know when you're being rejected when I was being rejected by my peers as I started pushing back against the left, I had to really make sure I was constantly trying to keep myself in check from going too far, just out of that real emotional feeling of rejection. And I think that's really hard to do. And I've done it imperfectly, but it's interesting. You said temperament, and when I think temperament, that seems almost genetic. But you are talking about it as a skill you can encourage and develop.
Well, it may be both. It might be genetic component to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is always so fun and enlightening, and I'm so grateful for your voice out in the culture wars and you, and I loved your book. I hope everybody goes and buys it, and everyone listening to this should. And where can we find you and your book and whatever else you want to promote?
Yeah, so check out the book wherever you buy books. I also read the audiobook myself if you like my voice. It's called The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. And then you can also check out my podcast, which is called Conversations with Coleman, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Great. And are you online? Should we follow you anywhere?
Yeah, go to my Twitter is @ColdXman, and check out my Substack, which I call Coleman's Corner.
I like it. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bridget.
The check-in with Bridget and Cousin Maggie can now be found at Phetasy.com. It's been titled Another Round with Bridget Phetasy, and it's now in video.
This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.